So Ray, thank you. First of all, I must say, of all the unknown facts about me, to suggest that I was charming in any circumstance, it's even unknown to me. So for that, and I do want to say I'm a huge admirer of the Social Enterprise Program. In fact, there are more graduates of that program working in the New York City public school system than all the graduates of all the business schools in the entire country probably right now. So it's an amazing tribute, I think, to the school, the commitment to the school, to social enterprise. We're located close to Wall Street, but we don't pay the same amount as Wall Street. So it's terrific that you do it. A lot of friends here in the room. I'm going to walk through a lot of information well known to a lot of people, but I want to frame it. I think we're at an inflection point, so I think you come together at a time when really powerful and important things are happening in public education. I want to just step back for a historical moment so I can frame the discussion and then hope we can open up for some dialogue. So you all know in 1983, we had a presidential commission, A Nation at Risk, and they issued a report which is summed up in a single line. And it says, if an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. All right? So in 1983, we said it was a nation at risk. Since then, almost 30 years later, we've more than doubled in real dollars the amount of money we spend on public education, and if anything, the results are moving in the wrong direction. And the question is, why? Well, there's one hypothesis I'll get to in a second, which Charles Murray put on the op-ed pages of the New York Times yesterday. Basically, these kids can't learn, so don't get too excited about it. Let them choose, they'll feel better, but the power of education is on the margins. But I think there's a much more important reason, and it goes to what's happening now in politics. And some of what you're saying, Carolyn will get up and talk about her results and other things, about the way the numbers are being used and misused and everything. But if I've learned one thing in the last 8 years, it's something I can express best in a light bulb joke. Some of you may remember, you're old enough to remember, there's a rash of light bulb jokes about 15, 20 years. You know, how many consultants does it take to change a light bulb? I don't know, I'll get back to you with an estimate next week. So my favorite light bulb joke is, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is only one, but the light bulb really has to want to change. And if I've learned one thing in 8 years, is the school system doesn't want to change. It wants more resources. But trust me, the defenders of the status quo have designed a system that works incredibly well for them. And unless we can muster both the moral courage and the political leadership to get this done, we are not going to succeed. And we need to know that. Echo chamber groups singing from an amen chorus are not going to transform the politics and the leadership that we need in education. I give the President and Secretary Duncan, as I'll say later, enormous credit. But let me run through the prelims so I can get to the action. When I say after 25, 27 years from a nation at risk, look at where we are. These are US on the 30 OECD countries, right, on the PISA exams, 13-year-olds, reading, math, and science, all in the wrong direction, right? 25 out of 30 OECD countries. That doesn't take into account what's going on in China and India and Brazil and in the rest of the world. Where else would we settle for those kind of numbers and negative downward trend? Same thing on college graduates. 30 OECD countries. Up until in 1995, we always used to be one. 1995, we were essentially tied for one. And now we're 15th, right? And look at all these yellow dots. Everybody else got blue on top of yellow. We got yellow on top of blue. We're stagnant. If you do nothing else, read Claudia Golden and Lawrence Katz's book, The Race Between Education and Technology. What they show is that equality in a country, economic equality, depends on your educational attainment keeping up with your technological advancement. And for the first 3 quarters of the century, the 20th century, we did that. From the late 19th century, late 20th century to today, we're not doing that anymore. As a result, we're creating wider and wider gaps. And when that intensifies in a global society, the world of haves and have-nots in our country will change dramatically. It may not happen today, it may not happen tomorrow. It is happening as we speak. And unless we begin to think about these challenges very differently, we're not going to succeed. Now, same thing, you all know this from 1990, you go back earlier, the racial and ethnic achievement gaps. These are 8th grade. You can look at most areas. Very little change. In NAEP terms, that's 2.5 or 3 years difference for 8th graders in reading. The good news, probably the best news you can see, at least while the achievement gap hasn't changed, the upward incline on NAEP math results. So overall, the racial and ethnic achievement gaps still paralyzing in their dimensions. I mean, to knock off 3 points over 20 years. If we continue at that rate, to close the remaining 30 points, smarter people than I, Larry Berger, could do the arithmetic, but they'll figure it out, right? So think about that, and then go back to my first and second chart on where we are globally. Now, the answer that the apologists give is, it's the kids, it's poverty, it's the families. Look, I grew up in poverty, in public housing. I understand dysfunctionalities in families. I'm not Pollyannish about anything. But what we know is the same kids in different schools, indeed the same kids in different classrooms, we can get dramatically different outcomes. There's so many researchers in this room who have proven that time and again. My own favorite on this, if you take home nothing else, take home this slide, because Charles Murray forgot to read it yesterday. This is 4th grade math in all the big urban cities. I disaggregated it, and I must say I pressed Jonah Rockoff that I knew the word disaggregate this morning, so I'm going to keep using it. But I disaggregated it for all these cities for black students eligible for federally subsidized lunch, right? So that's the cohort. That's not a privileged cohort in any of these major cities. Boston at 230, Detroit at 197. That's 3 years of learning in the 4th grade, and major differences between cities like LA and DC. Same thing true in the 8th grade. Again, look at the Boston up here, 266, 269, down to 233. What is that? That's not family, that's not zip code, that's not skin color, that's not poverty. That's the power of education, even at the school district level. So when you look at what Carolyn Hoxby did when she compared individual schools, or you look at some of the work that Jonah and Doug have done, and you see the differences in outcomes, don't believe for a second that we can't get very, very different outcomes. Can we close every achievement gap? Can we solve every problem? We don't know, because we haven't been serious in trying this. So, okay, what is the elephant in the room, which is what I want to talk about, which is always disturbing to people. But if we don't talk about this slide and the next slide, we're going to waste our time. And this is the elephant we don't talk about. The heart of the challenge is more effective teachers. A McKinsey study done by Michael Barber, known to most of you, a guy who was Tony Blair's education advisor and probably the most thoughtful guy I've met on these issues. Quality of an education system cannot exceed the quality of its teachers. Makes sense. Top performing school systems internationally attract more able people into the teaching profession, leading to better outcomes. The top performing systems we study recruit their teachers from the top third. Conversely, low performing systems rarely attract the right people, a new commission, etc. In America, we are recruiting our teachers from the bottom third of high school students going to college. So right there, the shift because of feminism from the people who entered the teaching profession, the largest human capital subsidy we saw was when women almost invariably go into teaching and a few other professions. All of that has changed. And so we're not drawing and attracting the right people. And what makes it much more troubling is the Aspen Commission conclusion, which we all know, that the teacher quality is unevenly distributed. Students with the greatest needs tend to have access to the least qualified and least effective teachers. So if we don't focus on this, the way we recruit, the way we retain, the way we reward, the consequences and accountability for teaching, we're not going to succeed. And this is what the big, big fight is about. The current system is built on 3 pillars. It's built on lockstep pay, seniority, and life tenure. And those are the 3 pillars of mediocrity. Last night I was privileged, truly privileged. I was at a concert with Yo-Yo Ma Maniacs and It's Got Perlman, the 3 of them on stage, right? 3 of the greatest musicians in the history of the world on one stage together. And all I kept thinking of is if we put orchestras together the way we hire school teachers, far fewer people would be listening to music today. If we don't create a system in which excellence is rewarded and supported and developed and cultivated, we will fail. If we continue to think The solutions are going to be in other areas, all of which are important, after school, preschool, but after school or preschool without good quality teaching is not going to succeed. Curriculums, much more rigorous curriculums and standards, but without great teachers, we're not going to succeed. And as long as we allow these massive inequities in the system. So take, for example, my favorite of my examples is I have to pay math teachers and gym teachers, physical education teachers, the same thing. I got nothing against physical education. I love them. I want the best in New York City. But the supply-demand curve for those two intersections is entirely different. So I am short highly effective math teachers all the time. When I'm short highly effective math teachers, which kids you think are short? You think it's the kids on the east side of Central Park, the west side of Central Park, or the north side of Central Park? So long as we don't address the heart of the challenge, we won't win. Let's go then to what I think is the backbone of the solution. And I learned all of this from Jim Liebman, who's really been inspirational to me, not just as a colleague and friend, but as a real educational leader. So everybody says when I talk about this, I'm a technocrat. So I decided to use a quote from somebody that nobody would ever accuse of technocrat, Al Shanker, right? Because he's obviously a deep humanist. But this is, to me, the whole story in the beginning. The key is that unless there is accountability, we'll never get the right system. As long as there are no consequences, check this out, no consequences if kids or adults don't perform. As long as this discussion is not about education and student outcomes. It's not a lot here about class size or inputs or the color of the room or anything. As long as it's not about education and student outcomes, we're playing the game as to who has the power. Shanker understood that deeply. Unless you start with a very heavy emphasis on accountability, you'll never get the system with all the other pieces falling in place. That's absolutely right. And then the second, Jim Collins' good to great, which is what the big fight we're having now. Because everybody says, well, sure, we're all for accountability, but there's no system of accountability that's any good, right? Every one of them, principles are arbitrary, the data's no good, this is no good, if we do it that way it won't work. And so, Jim Collins, who's written so intelligently on this, I use these two quotes to me. If we listen up to these two things, we'll move forward. Throw up our hands and say we cannot measure performance in social sectors the way we do in business is simply a lack of discipline. All indicators are flawed, whether qualitative or quantitative, and he starts, of course, with test scores are flawed. Thank you for that. Mammograms are flawed, crime data are flawed, customer service, patient outcome data are flawed. What matters is not finding a perfect indicator, but settling upon a consistent and intelligent method of assessing your output results and tracking your trajectory with rigor. We've got to get real about that, because otherwise we will constantly debate how many angels on the head of a pin. The systems will never be perfect enough, and then we will eschew accountability. So in New York, under Jim's leadership, essentially, that's been the core, the backbone of the work we have been doing. And we have the what and the how, the evaluate and the enable. Our system is not simply one of consequence. It's also one of empowerment. If you have an accountability system, you know what you're measuring, you know what you're driving at, then you can enable people to get there. If perfect teaching or effective teaching is something like pornography that we know when we see it, we won't get there. If we know how to measure it, we know what metrics to put behind it, we'll succeed. So in New York, under Jim's leadership, the core, everybody has to do NCLB, but I've always thought NCLB is a flawed evaluation system. I give it credit for moving the metrics. But our key three things are our progress report, which compares apples to apples, looks at schools similarly situated, sees which ones make progress, which ones don't. So 2 schools in high poverty neighborhoods getting different results, the kind of thing I was talking about when I showed you that slide on 4th grade NAEP for low-income African Americans. And we put letter grades on it. Letter grades send a stiff message, but you know what? It gets people's attention. My favorite story, a reporter who wrote a dozen stories over 3 years criticizing us because she could find in 1,600 schools a grade that somebody disagreed with. And she thought this was very funny. I was having breakfast with her, and I said to her, where are you going to send your kid who was 4 years old? She said, I was going to send him to PSX, but they got a C on their progress report. So people get it. Quality reviews. Is a school designed, set up to do the work properly? Does it know how to use data? Does it know how to do professional development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And we publish and make those transparent for all our schools. School surveys where we get information from parents and so forth. And all of that gets rolled up and is transparent. And it causes heartache in the system, but it also causes some floor on which you can try to build change. And then equally important, because if you only do this piece, if accountability is simply a sledgehammer and not a spotlight, you won't succeed. Periodic assessments, so data that we give our teachers to use, low-stakes exams, so that we don't have to wait for the end of the year. You can tell pretty early on through predictive and summative assessments what's going down with your kids and where you need to make mid-course corrections and adjustments. Teacher data reports, which I'm going to come back and talk about. How our teachers are doing, taking accountability to that level. The ARIS system, which Jim and Larry Berger together deserve enormous credit. It's one of the most effective data systems I've seen, not just in education. We'll come to that in a second. Then our Children First Intensive, investing heavily in very tailored professional development so that our teachers, ultimately working in inquiry teams. When I got to the system, there was no such thing as inquiry, and people didn't work in teams. Together, using data off the periodic assessments, data from our teacher data reports, all contained in here, and then knowledge sharing. Those are the key elements of what I believe is an evolving but built out accountability system. So here's our progress report. We look at the environment, largely surveys, some attendance, student performance, a relatively small piece, and more than half on student progress. We compare schools to similarly situated schools, we cohort them, and we give them a letter grade. Now, why does this matter? A lot of people say, well, you know, these are just test scores and everything, and, you know, if they go up and they don't go up. So Jim and his team did this, and I love to show this because people don't believe it. And if you don't believe it, talk to Jim about it later because I didn't do the work. But Jim and his team did this analysis. See, in No Child Left Behind, you see this number here, level 3, that's proficiency. And level 3 is basically what you need to get. If you get to 2.9, it's worthless. And if you get to 4.0, it gives you nothing because everything is level 3 in terms of the accountability system. So what did they do? We use 1/10 of a point. We go from 1 all the way up to 4.5. And they just interdigitate. You get 3 questions right, you're at 2.6. You get 4 questions, you're at 2.8, etc. We don't look at just 3s and 4s. And that's the way our accountability system works on our progress report. So when you're figuring out what grade you got here, we're looking at these to the 10th of a point decimal place. And what do we show? These are Regents diplomas on this axis, on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis, this is your average 8th grade. We mix math and English language arts, your average proficiency, okay? So if we got all our kids to level 3, our Regents graduation rate would be 55%, better than it is right now, but not remotely satisfactory. And yet that's where No Child left off. If we get all our kids to 3.5, which means usually answering a handful more questions on the math and ELA test correctly, if we got them to 3.5, it correlates with an 80% graduation, Regents graduation. This doesn't include locals. So when people tell you these test scores don't matter, or people say testing should be harder, I agree testing should be harder. I don't think a level 3 should equate with a 55% graduation rate. But trust me, if you look at the fine points in all of this, you will see big, big distinctions and moving kids past 3 and rewarding them. I used to have principals show me all the kids right above level 3 and right below level 3. And they'd say, the way I got big gains is kids above level 3 I focused on, and I kept them above level 3. Kids below level 3, I focused on them and I bumped them over level 3. I said, what about all the other kids? He said, you can't do everybody, Chancellor. So if you look at it this way, you look at it in a very different kind of way. Now here's the ARIS system. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. It's got a parent link, translation, walkthroughs explaining to parents information about their kid. We've got several 100,000 parents in New York that are now using ARIS Parent Link. When they go to schools, and every time Jim speaks to them, he said, get on this before you meet with your teachers so that you go in there prepared to have a real discussion. Not, how's my kid doing? Oh, he's doing fine. Goodbye. I'll see you next year. This piece for us is the most important piece, and it constantly evolves. And I give Larry and Wireless enormous credit for the work they did on this. It's very sophisticated stuff. Cost us a fair piece of change, but it was worth every penny of it. And it looks at student profile year to year, all of those assessments, periodic, summative, predictive that we have, the prior teacher's email address, gives you real data by classroom, by student, by school, whatever level you want it. And we have all sorts of predefined and custom reports. We're now developing ARIS local for the things the school thinks are important. But this thing is a treasure trove of really important data. And the next thing is connect. There's a big myth in education. I get asked, why don't you just fix the schools? Like I can sit at Central, call 2 people and say, just go fix the school. No, there's this big myth that there's a whole bunch of pointy-headed bureaucrats and we're just smarter than everybody else, but we don't want to get off our duff and get out there and fix it. But the truth of the matter is the knowledge is out there in the schools. And our question is to create, our challenge is to create horizontality, not vertical. If you have horizontality, then these people are learning. So some of my schools do incredibly well with English language learners, and others don't. And why shouldn't they be learning from each other? So we've created both communities and resources on ARIS, and they're talking to each other, as well as having people at Central doing real knowledge management by coming in with resources behind it. So this is a typical kind of ARIS report. It's one of a million that we now print out, looking at different math classes, how the kids are doing comparatively. You break that down by race, you break that down by English language learner, you can look at various teachers, and so forth. Now, second step, and a different kind of accountability and equally important, and I know you're going to have a lot of discussion on charter. Let me just frame this, because this has been a critical piece of the work we have done. I don't think there's any city in the country that's done more to create public school choice than New York City. We've opened up 335 new schools, 82 charter schools. So you're looking over there, over 400 schools that we have opened in the city, some transfer, GED, and other programs. But why did we do all of this? These are all schools of choice. Nobody is required to go to any of these schools. And yet everybody wants to argue about this piece. And that's because what Al Shanker said is right. When people are arguing about this, it's all about power. It's not about accountability and performance. So there's big debate, front page of the Times the other day, Sunday, saying, charters are not outperforming. See, parents don't send their kids to charters. They send their kids to a school. And the question is that school outperforming? And one way to bring accountability to a system is give people real choice. So in the charter, non-charter debate, I'm a big charter proponent, but I don't believe calling the school a charter is going to lead to higher performance. And we've seen a lot of it. Now, Carolyn is going to tell you about the charters we've developed in New York, which are clearly, as a group, getting better results, but some of them are not getting great results either. And to me, the way to conceptualize this is it's very hard to get good people to come here and work with us and develop new and different and challenging schools. And we're doing that in New York. And if Richard Kahn and Urban Assembly wants to do it in a traditional public school, God bless them. And if people who are running Young Women's Leaders or Eagle Academy want to do it in a public school, God bless them. And if Daisha Toll and Dave Levin and Eva Moskowitz want to do it in a charter school, God bless them. As long as two things attain. One is that they got to perform. If they don't, all of them should be shut down, the ones that don't perform. And second, if they do perform, we should have more of them. And the other thing is it's got to be for free in a non-discriminatory way, which our schools, our new schools and charter schools are all about. They're not screen schools. And when that happens, and you empower parents, then you get accountability in the system. So all the pushback is, look at New York today, 50,000 parents on wait lists for charters. I was in Brooklyn last night, and this parent, tears in her eyes. And if you haven't seen this new documentary, Lottery, see it. So 50,000 parents are voting with their feet. So that's why there's pushback, because the union wants to make sure that those kids stay in union schools. And charters have the option to be union or not. And therefore, that's a power play. And those 50,000 parents are not making a mistake. And if they are making a mistake, God bless them, it's their kid. And all of us, there's not a person in this room who would tolerate a system with non-choice for their own child. Not a person in this room would tolerate a system with non-choice. There's not a person in this room who would allow me to assign your kid to one of the 19 schools that I try to shut down this year that the court enjoined. There's not a person in this room that would allow me to assign your kid randomly to a public school in New York City. Why should poor people not be able to vote with their feet? And let them sort out whether they want to go to Urban Assembly or to Harlem Success. That is a meaningful form of accountability. The next form of accountability is going to be the fight we're having right now, and goes to where I started, the heart of the challenge. Real teacher accountability. Of course, the race to the top, Secretary Duncan, President Obama, that is moving forward quite aggressively. And I think if you see what's going on now, there was a bill in Florida, it didn't get passed, but it came very close. There's a bill in Colorado that may get passed. Michelle Reed's contract in D.C. Garth Harries just executed a contract up in New Haven. The two states that won race to the top, Delaware and Tennessee, watch what they're doing, what's going on in Houston's pay-for-performance system. This is happening. It's not going to happen immediately. It's not going to happen without setbacks in the process. But teacher accountability is going to happen. And once it happens, the same kind of ARIS stuff I showed you before, the enabling thing. Those teachers that are not getting the results we want, we will much be able to effectively to support them. Professional development can be much more powerful. Watching colleagues who are getting results, designating master teachers who are getting results so that we actually understand what we're measuring and what we're doing. That's all going to come. Last point, and I'm going to end on this, is the whole thing we're doing in New York with our innovation zone. One of the other ways to make teachers more effective and to make instruction, which is what this is about, much more effective, is to use technology in entirely different ways. So whether it's our School of One, whether it's our iSchool, I've never understood. We've got kids in this city who want to take advanced placement online. And I think that's a terrific thing. And yet until David took over, the basic position in Albany was, well, you can't take an AP class online. Some of my kids, 3, 4 kids, want to take physics. The school can't afford to teach. So I said to the previous commissioner, I said, well, why don't we let them take the course online? And he said, well, no, because you need to have seat time. And I said, well, but if the kid passes the course, he gets credit for college. Why shouldn't he get credit for high school, right? I mean, that seemed reasonable to make sense. So I said this for 8 years, and I was told basically, well, that's not the way we do it here. But if you think about it, if we use technology, if we use online, if we think differently about the service delivery challenge, then we can really supplement, augment what teachers do. There are brilliant people out there that you can bring into the classroom, like our iSchool does. So fundamentally, we're doing, right now, the first phase, we're doing 3 things. Virtual learning. We've got 40 schools piloting online instruction, and David and John King have been terrific and helpful and supportive on this. We've got 30 schools using adaptive. We're going to use 3 different platforms, customized database instruction, one an Israeli company, Time to Know, one Compass Learning, and the third one is, I'll think of it in a second anyhow. So with 3 platforms, it's being reviewed by Ed Labs up at Harvard in a double-blind study. We'll see what, and this will enable, I believe, teachers to bring much better content. And then time and staffing, we've got a school that we developed with the UFT in which basically creating very different schedule and staffing times. So this is the School of One. Those of you who haven't seen it, I don't want to take you through it, but I'd be happy to set up an appointment. It's going to be operating in one of our schools in a couple of weeks. It's really worth seeing. It moves the locus of instruction from the classroom to the individual student. This is the adaptive learning technologies that I was talking about before. Pearson is the 3rd platform, Time to Know, Pearson and Compass, and we'll see what we get. These, if you haven't seen these platforms, they're really very interesting. One of the things I said to the American Association of Publishers, spoke to them 2 weeks ago, and I said, I went through this, I literally did, with Napster. When my company owned Napster and a music company, and basically the music company was unwilling to change its business model because it was doing well, and as a result lost out in the online space. And I told the AAP basically, 5 years from now I don't believe there'll be textbooks. You guys better start developing the platforms and cannibalize your existing textbook business. We'll see how effective. That was Generation Schools. Generation Schools, 180 days, 200 days, teacher time, etc., etc. So, and then the iSchool, which we're doing for all sorts of opportunities to bring in learning from other parts of the city. I've been in there where teachers in other parts of the city who are really terrific in math are now online working with the kids in another school. They finish teaching their 4th period in one school, next period they're teaching in another school. They get per session for it, they like it, and it's a way to, again, bring talent in. Why wouldn't we do things like that? So let me end on this because I think that we really are. I've never been more optimistic, although I'll be the first to admit this climb is not going to be easy. It's going to be steep, and there's going to be a lot of challenges ahead. I think it's entirely winnable. And I think really the future of the nation depends on us being bold and us being prepared to take the heat. A friend of mine I came to know as a parent in New York City. The wonderful thing about parents, whenever they have something on their mind about the school system, they insist that the chancellor know about it. So I've come to know a lot of parents this way. This guy's name is Leo Stevens. Leo Stevens was an African-American man living in District 2. Unfortunately, he died this week at a much too early age. But he wrote me lots of emails, and he always signed them. He had his email with his signature. And at the bottom of, under his signature, he always used this Martin Luther King quote, which somehow resonates with me. And given that his funeral was Tuesday, I wanted to read it in his memory today. Cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time, said Martin Luther King, when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular. But one must take it because it is right. I think the future of this country depends on leaders, the people in this room, willing to take a position because it's right. I think we know it's right, and I think our kids and our nation depend on it. Thank you very much. Yeah. Unfortunately, my time is constrained to matrix. After all of this good fun, I've got to go back and listen to the mayor cut my budget. So this, trust me, it's the highlight of my day. And the press asking me why he didn't cut the cops and only cut the teachers. So have fun. Go at it. Comments, questions, sure. Tell people who you are.
I'm Roddy Klein. I'm a member of the Social Enterprise Advisory Board of the Business School. I have a question about Secretary Duncan and the work they're doing in the government. They referenced race to the top. Can you expand on that and perhaps react to the article a couple of days ago in the New York Times?
Which particular article?
There was an article 2 days ago.
About Arnie and how he's...
Yes.
Yeah. So look, I think what he's doing is terrific. I've written about it, I've talked about it. I think it's terrific in the following sense. Government used to, including the Department of Ed, give you money for showing up. So Title I, indeed, the worse you perform, the more you get, right? And I never understood it. A school that was doing poorly, we pump a lot of money in, it starts to do better, we take the money away. I mean, in every other sector of the world, when things are doing well, you double down, you don't. So what they're trying to do is incentivize what they think are core things, some of which I've talked about today: charters, teacher effectiveness, principal effectiveness, data systems, much higher standards, etc. Those are the core drivers. And what they're saying to states is, at a time when states are in deep trouble, is if you want a lot more money, these are the things we need. Now I thought, and I'll end on this, I thought Arnie did something that was very interesting. There was a big debate over whether stakeholder buy-in or bold and aggressive reform was more important. And in the last week, he's made it absolutely clear that bold and aggressive reform. Look, we'd all like bold and aggressive reform with stakeholder buy-in. That's the optimum, and we should all strive for it. Stakeholder buy-in matters, it'll help us get the work done. But in the end, and I give him a lot of credit, because it's always easier, particularly in Washington, to sing from the hymnal of let's all love one another. But he was saying basically, even if some people don't love one another, the boldness in terms of those categories is critical.
Nelson Smith, National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. I'm really interested in the innovation zone, and I wonder if you could talk a bit more about trying to get technology into a system like this and why districts tend to resist that so much. So few districts have actually adopted what's out there in some meaningful way, like you're trying to do with the innovation zone.
Well, I think there are 3 or 4 dimensions of it. One is a huge cost investment. We don't have the infrastructure. Our kids don't have the devices. A lot of them, we got to wire the homes. New York City just got a $23 million grant to wire the homes of kids in some of our high poverty neighborhoods, which will help us. But there's that issue. Second issue is, quite frankly, just a labor issue. I mean, what labor wants to make sure is that there's additional technology, but not substitute technology for teacher time. So that's what that seat time requirement was all about. And why, for example, when people talk about virtual schools, I mean, as long as there's real robust accountability, then we can tell which of these things are working or not working. And the third thing is we've got to really train our workforce to effectively use this technology. This thing, Time to Know, or Compass Learning that I'm talking about, It's going to take a lot of time. But I will tell you, if you haven't seen it, really get in touch with anybody, and I'll set up this visit to the School of One. What they're doing there is really groundbreaking because it's fundamentally tailoring the delivery to the individual child. And different kids moving at different paces, learning through different modalities, including, for example, there's this wonderful program that a guy from Columbia B School developed. And it's an online game. It's just like one of those Sony games. And basically, in order to be master of the universe, which particularly boys seem to like this, I don't know why, but in order to be master of the universe, you have to solve increasingly hard mathematical equations. And we have some of these kids at School of One, they're doing that there and clicking away and so forth, and it's really powerful. Now, for other kids, they're learning math through music, and so this kind of differentiation, but you've got to retrain a workforce, because people don't walk into the classroom knowing how to do this.
William Goodlow with Sponsors for Educational Opportunity. Teacher training specifically, can you discuss some of the challenges and opportunities related to training, professional development for teachers? There was an article, a cover story in the New York Times Magazine a couple of months ago that discussed developing existing professional development for teachers. There's evidence that suggests they sort of plateau at the 5-year point, which coincides with tenure in some cases. How has the DOE taken on the challenge of trying to develop the teachers and how they use curriculum, lesson plans?
Absolutely, but first of all, you got to start before they get to the DOE. And Commissioner Steiner and the work he and the regents are doing on teacher education. There's zero accountability in teacher education, right? So, and they've got a monopoly. You said from going from suing Microsoft to getting $50 million from Bill Gates. What I think Bill and I both know is I went from suing a private monopoly to running a public monopoly. So we both got that. Had nothing to do with Sean, by the way. But so David and the regents are trying to hold ed schools accountable for results, and that's what I believe. If you don't build it on the backbone of accountability, so we've invested very heavily in things like helping our teachers use data. In answer to Nelson's question about learning to use technology, we're constantly evaluating it to see what results and returns we're getting in terms of student outcomes. What used to pass for professional development drove me nuts. A whole bunch of people come to a meeting. On a good day it was bagels with locks, on a bad day it was bagels without locks. This is New York. And they sit there for a whole day, and then they go back. Nobody measured, nobody cared. People didn't have to be in the school. So if you look at the work, the more important, which Jonah and Doug and others are talking about, the more important is not that they plateau in 5 years, but that there's a huge bell curve during those 5 years. And how you shift that bell curve, standard deviation, to get very powerful outcomes is the critical question. But if we simply say professional development is a good thing, rather than saying accountable professional development that changes student outcomes is a good thing, we'll fail. All right, I got time for one more, unless there's no more. Okay, thank you all very much.